Everyone thought the crying was just a spoiled child making a scene. But Sophia knew better the second she saw the little boy clutching the silver buttons on his coat, the same way she used to hold on to her mother when she was scared. The staff was annoyed, the guests were irritated, and the grandfather, the tycoon no one dared to approach, was losing patience fast. But what they didn't know, what no one in that elegant restaurant even suspected, is that the boy wasn't crying because he was hungry, or tired, or misbehaving. He was crying for a reason the tycoon had spent years trying to forget. And the moment Sophia knelt beside him and whispered, "He just misses his mom," the entire restaurant froze, including the tycoon, because she had just spoken a truth that no one else dared to say out loud. The crying had started as a soft whimper, the kind that blended into the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of polite conversation. But within minutes, it had grown sharp enough to cut through the golden ambience of the five-star dining room, until every chandelier seemed to tremble with the sound. Guests shifted in their seats, exchanging annoyed glances over their menus. A couple at the window whispered angrily about the lack of discipline. A group of businessmen paused mid-sentence, their expressions tightening as if their stock had just dropped. Even the string quartet faltered for a fraction of a second, the violinist's bow shaking before she recovered. At the center of it all was a little boy in an expensive navy sweater, cheeks blotched red, curls damp from tears. He clung desperately to the silver buttons on his coat, gripping them the way drowning people grip air. His tiny chest heaved with each sob, eyes swollen with a fear no one bothered to name, except Sophia. She stood a few steps away, barely breathing as she watched him, one hand still wrapped around the tray she hadn't gotten the chance to set down. She'd only been in the restaurant for 6 months, but she already understood what others didn't. Children didn't cry like that because they were spoiled. They cried like that because something inside them was breaking. Around her, the staff muttered under their breaths. "Third time this week," one server hissed. "He always does this," another groaned. "Rich kid tantrum," the bartender whispered, shaking his head. But Sophia saw something different, something painfully familiar. It was the way his fingers tightened and loosened, tightened and loosened. The same rhythm her hands had made the night her mother left her with a neighbor she barely knew. The same rhythm she still felt in her bones whenever loneliness crept too close. She set the tray aside and wiped her palms on her apron, steadying her breath. She wasn't supposed to intervene. She was supposed to wait for instructions. Stay invisible. Stay small. But the boy's sobs carved a path straight into her chest. Then she looked up and met the eyes of the one person no one in that room dared to contradict, the tycoon. He stood tall in his black suit and golden waistcoat, his polished cane resting near his gloved hand. His top hat cast a shadow across the deep lines of his face, a man carved from authority, from power so old and enduring, it didn't need to speak to be obeyed. Every waiter stiffened whenever he lifted a finger. Managers whispered his name like a warning. Guests lowered their voices when he walked by. But right now, he looked tired and helpless and dangerously close to losing control. "James," he murmured to the maitre d', "why is he still crying?" The maitre d' bowed his head, nervous sweat gathering at his temples. "Sir, we've tried everything." "Everything," the tycoon repeated, the word hollow. Sophia swallowed hard. She'd heard rumors that the boy's mother was gone, that the tycoon didn't allow her name to be spoken, that grief clung to this family like perfume. But rumors were dangerous things, and in this room they weren't hers to whisper. Still, her feet moved before permission arrived. She approached the boy slowly, lowering herself until her knees touched the polished tile. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched him, letting him feel her presence before she dared to invade his small, trembling world. His sobs softened into shaky breaths, the way storms slow when they sense safety nearing. "It's okay," she whispered in Spanish, her voice gentle, warm, a sound made of softness and memory. "Estoy aquí." The boy looked up, and for the first time someone actually saw him. Sophia brushed a curl from his forehead. "Hey, pequeño," she said, switching to English. "Can you look at me?" He did. Eyes red, lashes wet, hands still tight around the silver buttons. And then she knew. Not because he told her, Not because anyone had explained, but because fear had a shape, and she recognized it. She placed a hand softly on his shoulder, the way her mother once had when Sophia was small and afraid of being left behind. "He just misses his mom," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and the entire restaurant froze. The businessmen swallowed their complaints mid-breath. The violinist lowered her bow. Even the bartender stopped polishing his glass. A silence deeper than disapproval filled the room. Something colder, older, something that touched the Tycoon like an unwelcome ghost, dragging its fingers across his spine. He turned toward her sharply. His eyes, usually sharp as silver, widened, not in anger but in something far more dangerous. Recognition. Because Sophia had just named the one truth he'd locked away behind wealth, power, and silence. The boy hiccuped, then leaned into her, not because she asked him to, but because children always know where warmth lives. Sophia held him gently, her heart beating as though the past and present had collided inside her chest. She hadn't meant to speak the words out loud. She hadn't meant to break the unspoken rule of the entire dining room. No one mentions the mother, but she had. Because the boy needed someone who could see past the sweater, past the wealth, past the perfectly polished world he'd been forced to cry inside. When she finally lifted her gaze, the Tycoon was staring at her, unmoving, unreadable, shaken. His fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. His jaw clenched once, then loosened. His breath caught in his throat like a man hearing a name he hadn't spoken in years. Around him, the staff exchanged terrified glances, because Sophia had just crossed the line that none of them dared to step near. But the Tycoon didn't speak. He just looked at her, and looked at his grandson, and looked at the fear he'd spent years burying. And then, so quietly even the chandeliers seemed to lean in, he asked the one question that would change everything. "What did you say?" The question didn't slice through the room so much as sink into it, slow and heavy, like a stone dropped into a deep pool. Conversations didn't just stop, they recoiled. The air itself seemed to contract around the sound of his voice. Le Bernardin, with all its polished silver and curated calm, suddenly felt like a stage where someone had missed their cue and spoken a forbidden line. Sophia felt every pair of eyes at her back, the weight of attention pinning her in place. She kept her hand on the boy's small shoulder, thumb moving in a slow, grounding circle. His breathing was still jagged, but the sobs had turned inward, softer, heavy instead of sharp. She could almost hear the staff thinking, "Say you misspoke, apologize. Back away." She didn't. For a heartbeat, she didn't move at all. Her own pulse thudded in her ears, steady and loud. There was a familiar feeling rising in her chest, the old instinct to shrink, to make herself small, to avoid being noticed by any man who had the voice and money to ruin a life with a single sentence. She recognized it and didn't obey it this time. The maitre d' stepped forward, his practiced smile stretched too tight. "Mr. Harrow." She only meant. The Tycoon didn't look at him. His gloved hand rose a fraction, a quiet command that sliced the maitre d' out of the moment without a single word. The man froze, then drifted back like a wave pulling away from shore, leaving Sophia alone in the space between power and truth. "I asked," the Tycoon said, eyes locked on her. "What you said." The boy flinched at the tone, fingers tightening around Sophia's sleeve. The fabric dug into her skin, an anchor more than an inconvenience. She drew a breath, tasting citrus and butter and something metallic beneath it, the faint tang of fear shared by everyone watching. "I said," she replied, voice low but steady, "he misses his mom." No defiance. No apology. Just the same sentence, offered again like a fragile object she refused to drop. A hush moved through the tables closest to them, a subtle ripple of intake breath and shifting posture. It wasn't just the word mom. It was the way it landed at this table, in front of this man. People who had been muttering about discipline and rich kids' tantrums now sat with their backs straighter, their eyes fixed on the Tycoon as if waiting to see how someone with that much money handled something as unruly as grief. The boy's shoulders shuddered once, then settled. His hands had left the silver buttons and found her wrist instead, small fingers wrapping around her pulse. She could feel his heartbeat, wild and staccato, trying to catch up with itself. The Tycoon's gaze dropped to that grip before returning to her face. Up close, his age was more visible, Fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint sag at the edge of his jaw, the heaviness of a man carrying more than his body was designed for. But there was nothing frail about his presence. He had the stillness of old trees and old money, the kind that didn't need to move to dominate a space. Did someone, he asked slowly, tell you to say that? There it was. The first defense. It couldn't be instinct, couldn't be empathy. It had to be manipulation, gossip, some staff member overstepping. It was easier, she understood, to believe that than to admit a stranger had walked straight into the heart of something he'd spent years burying. No, she said. His eyes narrowed. Then what gives you the right to decide what he feels? A server near the bar winced, as if he'd just heard the crack of a firing squad. The bartender, halfway through polishing a glass, set it down on the counter in slow motion. From the back, someone whispered, "She's dead," too loudly, then clamped a hand over their mouth. Sophia turned her head just enough to look at the child, not to escape the Tycoon's gaze, but to remind herself who she was answering for. The boy wouldn't meet his grandfather's eyes. He stared at the tablecloth instead, lips trembling, lashes still beaded with tears. His small chest rose and fell in uneven waves. "I don't decide what he feels," she replied. "He's deciding that. I'm just not pretending it's something else." The Tycoon's fingers closed more tightly around the cane beside his chair. The gold handle glinted under the chandelier, catching the light in a way that made her think of doors closing, locks turning. His voice dropped lower, like a storm pulling in on itself. "You think you understand him better than I do?" he asked. Sophia's mind flashed with images that didn't belong to this room. A fluorescent-lit hallway in Queens, a chipped plastic button between her fingers, the sound of a woman's footsteps fading and never returning, a neighbor who shrugged and turned up the TV, a girl who learned not to ask why. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones most afraid to name what hurts." Something flickered in his eyes at that. Annoyance, maybe, or recognition, or the irritation of a man not used to being seen accurately by anyone who wasn't billing him by the hour. The boy's breath hitched. Sophia felt it against her arm. He shifted, pressing himself closer, as if her words had nudged some door open inside him too. "He doesn't even say that word anymore," the Tycoon muttered almost to himself. "Hasn't in almost a year." A murmur moved through the nearest tables. Some guests pretended not to hear, eyes suddenly fascinated by their plates. Others watched openly, expressions softened, resentment drained and replaced by something else. Uneasy empathy. Sophia's voice gentled. "That doesn't mean it left his body," she said. "Sometimes the mouth stops, but the rest of you keeps calling for the person who's gone." She hadn't meant to reveal so much of herself in that sentence, but there it was, threaded between syllables, the familiar ache of a child waiting in a doorway for someone who would never appear. The Tycoon's gaze lingered on her face, searching for something. Mockery, pity, manipulation. He didn't find any of that. What he found instead was a steadiness that didn't quite match her position or paycheck, the kind of steadiness that came from surviving things no one in this room would ever put on a menu. "How did she die?" Sophia asked softly. Not to him, but to the air between them, to the boy. The question slipped out before she could stop it. The room went taut. "You don't ask that here," the walls seemed to say. "Not in a restaurant where grief is supposed to be dressed in black and seated privately." The boy's fingers dug into her skin. His lips parted. A small sound trembled out of him, more exhale than voice. "Car," he whispered. The word was almost lost in the hum of the refrigerators, the faint clink of ice in someone's glass. But the Tycoon heard it. His eyes shut for a second, brief but complete, like someone bracing for an impact he'd already survived once. Sophia swallowed. "That's a big thing for a little body to carry," she murmured. Her hand moved slowly up and down his back, the same motion she'd seen tired mothers make on crowded buses, the soothing rhythm of people who'd run out of words. She could feel the tension in him melt and reform, not gone, but reorganized around the fact that someone was finally willing to acknowledge the crater in his world. "We don't talk about her," the Tycoon said, the word rough as gravel. "It doesn't help." "It helps him to pretend she never existed?" Sophia asked quietly. He looked at her sharply, an old reflex snapping into place, the instinct to shut down anything that sounded like accusation. But anger couldn't quite find its footing here, not when his grandson was pressed against a stranger's apron, finally breathing without choking on sobs. At table 7, a woman in pearls touched her husband's hand and didn't pull away. At table 3, the businessman who'd been irritated moments ago now stared into their wine, suddenly fascinated by its depth. Along the wall, the string quartet remained perfectly still, instruments in their laps, waiting for a cue that wasn't going to come from the conductor. "How did you calm him?" the Tycoon asked at last, his voice thinner, as if he'd left some of its strength in that single concession. Sophia hesitated. The truth was simple, but she knew how it would sound to someone whose life had been built on strategies, not softness. "I didn't calm him," she said. "I let him be sad without treating it like bad behavior." He studied her for a long stretch of silence, as if no one had ever said anything quite so absurd to him, or quite so threatening. The notion that not fixing something could be the first step to healing it seemed to offend some deeply held law inside him. "You're a waitress," he said finally, not cruelly, but with the baffled bluntness of someone who thinks in hierarchies. "This isn't your responsibility." Sophia almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how small the word waitress sounded pressed up against the ache in the boy's eyes. She thought of all the things she'd carried to tables over the years: plates, glasses, special requests, unspoken tensions, quiet confessions overheard at midnight. Responsibility had never really cared about uniforms. "It is tonight," she said, "because I'm the one he reached for." As if to underline the point, the boy shifted, his arm wrapping around her neck now, small body trying to tuck itself into the space between her and the world. His voice emerged again, a breathy, broken syllable. "Mama." The word cracked the room open. No one gasped this time. The reaction was quieter, deeper, shoulders dropping, eyes dampening, throats tightening. There was something almost indecent about hearing that word here, in this glowing, expensive bubble where everything was plated and predictable. It reminded everyone in one swift stroke that life wasn't interested in reservation times. The Tycoon's hand tightened around his cane so hard the leather of his glove creaked. His eyes glistened, but he didn't blink the moisture away. It stayed there, softening the hard silver of his gaze, making him look, for the first time, less like an institution and more like a man who had once been someone's son, someone's husband, someone who had lost something he didn't know how to name. He looked at his grandson, really looked at him, not as an obligation or a legacy to be managed, but as a child with a wound he hadn't been able to legislate away. For a fraction of a second he seemed smaller in his seat, as if the weight of his own decisions had finally settled on his shoulders instead of everyone else's. In the periphery of Sophia's vision, she saw the restaurant manager appear near the bar, face pale, eyes darting between the Tycoon and her name tag as if calculating the cost of what was unfolding. This wasn't the kind of drama they knew how to spin into a good review. Sophia felt the old fear creep up again. Immigration papers, rent due, the fragility of a life built on tips and double shifts. A wrong word here could mean a quiet, "We've decided to go in another direction next week." But then the boy's fingers tightened around her neck, and she knew exactly which part of her she was going to listen to. The Tycoon exhaled slowly, as if making a decision hurt. He rose from his chair with deliberate, unhurried movements, the way someone stands at a graveside when they don't want to turn their back on what they're leaving. "Come with us," he said. The words didn't boom. They barely carried past the table, and yet the entire restaurant heard them. Every server, every guest, every musician understood. This was not a suggestion. It was an invitation with the same weight as his business deals, binding, transformative. Sophia frowned slightly, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Sir, I'm on shift. You're currently the only person he trusts," the Tycoon cut in, a faint edge of disbelief at his own sentence. "I'm not going to pry him off you in front of a room full of strangers." The boy clung tighter, as if terrified she might disagree. At the back, a dishwasher poked his head out of the kitchen door, eyes wide. At the bar, a couple exchanged a look of open fascination. Some part of the room seemed ready to applaud anything that got them out of their own rehearsed vulnerability. The manager took a step forward, panic written in every line of his body. "Mr. Harrow, perhaps we could arrange." Again, That small gloved hand lifted. The manager stopped as if he'd been yanked by a hook. Sophia's throat felt dry. "Where do you want to go?" she asked. The Tycoon looked around the dining room, at the chandeliers, at the guests pretending not to eavesdrop, at the staff frozen in their own anxiety. And his expression tightened. "Anywhere that isn't a spectacle," he said. "We're not doing this as a performance for people who came here to complain about the salt." For the first time, a faint, sober humor flickered between them, quick and unpolished. Sophia almost smiled, then didn't. The boy's weight in her arms was reminder enough that nothing about this was light. She shifted her footing, preparing to stand. Her knees protested from the time spent pressed against the cold marble, but she ignored the ache. Carefully, she slid one arm beneath the boy's legs. He didn't resist. He let her lift him, his small body folding naturally against her chest, his face nestling into the hollow between her neck and shoulder. The room watched, transfixed. She rose slowly, acutely aware of how exposed she felt. A waitress in a black apron holding the crying air of a man whose last name could buy and sell half the skyline. It would have been laughable if it hadn't felt so fragile. As she straightened, she caught a flicker of movement in the polished glass doors at the front of the restaurant. A shape outside, blurred by the reflections of chandeliers and winter lights. Someone stood there, just beyond the threshold, not yet inside but not walking away either. The doorman shifted, hand on the handle. Sophia tightened her hold on the boy. The Tycoon turned his head toward the entrance at the same moment she did. And just as she took her first step away from the table, the doors of Le Bernardin swung open with a soft, deliberate sigh, revealing a figure whose presence would make the night take a turn none of them were prepared for. The cold from outside slipped in first, a thin, sharp draft that curled along the marble floor and wrapped itself around ankles and chair legs. Then the doors finished opening, and the city poured into Le Bernardin in the shape of a single figure framed by the entrance lights. Snow had started again, soft and impatient, freckles of white catching in the woman's dark hair and on the shoulders of her long wool coat. She stood for a breath without stepping in, as if measuring the distance between the street and this carefully curated world. Behind her, taxis glowed yellow against the wet pavement, their reflections broken on the glass like scattered gold. She was not dressed like the guests, not glittering, not aggressively sleek. Her clothes were neat, serious, lived in. A charcoal coat belted at the waist, black boots with salt at the edges, a leather satchel pressed close to her side. A scarf the color of old wine was wrapped around her throat, tugged high as if she were still deciding whether she had the courage to speak. The doorman moved instinctively to greet her, but something in her posture, not arrogance, not entitlement, just a focused urgency, made him hesitate. She scanned the room quickly, the way people do when they're not sure if they're welcome, but know they're expected by fate anyway. Her gaze slid over chandeliers and linen, over faces that flinched and looked away until it stopped, on the corner banquette, on the boy in the navy sweater, on the man standing beside him, and then, like a finishing note in a chord, on Sophia. The boy stiffened in her arms. She felt it, that instant recognition that travels through a child's body before it reaches their brain. His fingers dug into her shoulder, then slackened, then clutched again, his breathing hitching in a way that had nothing to do with the cries from before. The Tycoon's expression changed very little, but what did move was telling. His jaw clenched, just once. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in the resignation of a man watching a consequence arrive precisely on schedule. He had known this moment was possible. That didn't make it easier to face. "Elena," he said, the name escaping him like a sigh he'd been trying not to release. The woman's shoulders rose with the sound of it. That alone told Sophia enough. This was not a stranger. This was someone whose name carried history, arguments, unanswered calls. Someone whose presence here tonight was less coincidence and more inevitability. She stepped inside fully now, the doors whispering shut behind her. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around her, but it did nothing to soften the tightness in her posture. As she walked, the staff parted for her almost unconsciously, reacting not to her status, but to the gravity that seemed to follow her. Up close, she looked younger than the weight in her eyes suggested. Late 30s, maybe. the faintest lines at the corners of her mouth carved by worry rather than years. Her features were sharp, familiar, the angle of her nose, the shape of her mouth, the dark curve of her brows. Sophia saw them echoed in the boy's face like someone had traced the same map twice with a slightly different pressure. "Auntie," the boy whispered against Sophia's neck, the word small but clear. Sophia swallowed. The sound of that one word turned the scene from uncomfortable to intimate in an instant. This wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was a family fault line, exposed under chandeliers. Elena's eyes shone, but she didn't cry. The tears stayed where they were, glimmering at the border without crossing. She stopped a few steps from the table, as if respecting some invisible line she'd been warned never to cross. "You brought him here again," she said quietly to the Tycoon. Her voice carried, not because it was loud, but because the room had become so still that even breath sounded disloyal. "Third time this week, isn't it?" He didn't answer. Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. It was a silence that said everything to anyone who knew how to listen. Yes and no. "I don't want to talk about why." Elena's gaze slid to her nephew. The sight of him clinging to a stranger, face red and damp, seemed to hit her harder than the chandeliers, the china, the polished wood. Her lips parted around a word that didn't quite make it out. "I called you," she said to the Tycoon, eyes drifting back. "3 times after the last episode. You didn't answer." "I was in meetings," he replied. It was the kind of answer that could mean many things. "I was busy. I was avoiding you. I didn't know what to say." All of them sounded thin against the tremble in the boy's fingers. Sophia tried to pull herself out of the center of it, but she was physically attached to the child. His arms looped around her like a question. There was no way to step back without peeling him off her, and that felt cruel in a way she refused to consider. So she stood there, holding him, the only person in the room whose clothes carried the smell of dishwater and citrus cleaner instead of perfume and legacy. Elena's gaze landed on her now, direct and searching. "Your staff," she said, not as an insult, more as a way to place the pieces. "You're the one who—" "I'm Sophia," she answered softly. "I just came to check on him." "Check on him," Elena repeated, something bitter and grateful braided together in her tone. In a room full of people pretending he's a disturbance instead of a child who lost his mother. A muscle jumped in the Tycoon's cheek. "We agreed," he said, his voice careful, as if stepping on glass, "not to keep tearing that wound open for him. We agreed." Elena's laugh was short, almost soundless. "You agreed, Henry." He was 4. He didn't agree to anything. He just watched you erase her. The boy made a small sound that might have been a whimper, or might have been a memory surfacing. Sophia felt it against her collarbone, a vibration more than a noise. Her own chest ached in answer. She had stood in too many rooms as a child listening to adults argue above her head, their words raining down like debris from a ceiling she wasn't tall enough to touch. "He doesn't say her name anymore," the Tycoon snapped, as if that was evidence, a victory. "That's progress." Elena's eyes flashed. "Or it's fear," she said. "Fear of what happens to the people in this family when they love someone you decide is inconvenient." That landed with an impact that rippled through more than just the 3 of them. The staff exchanged quick, panicked glances, suddenly aware they were hearing things they would never unhear. A couple at a nearby table pretended to check their phones, faces carefully turned away while their ears strained toward every word. Sophia wanted to disappear and to stay, both at once. Part of her wanted to hand the boy over and retreat to the safety of the kitchen's clatter, where problems were concrete and fixable. Undercooked fish, cold plates, orders lost in translation. Another part of her felt rooted here, as if leaving now would be a betrayal of something she didn't fully understand but recognized anyway. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you know what his therapist told you last month?" she asked the Tycoon. "You nodded, you paid, you left. But did you listen?" The Tycoon's jaw tightened. "Don't lecture me on what I pay for." "She said he needs space to grieve," Elena continued, undeterred. To speak about her without watching the adults in the room flinch like he set off a bomb. To cry without being dragged to a public place where everyone will stare at him like a malfunctioning accessory. That last word made Sophia's stomach twist. She thought of the boy pressed into his seat earlier, the expensive sweater, the forced stillness expected of him. She thought of her own childhood, of being told to be good, when what they really meant was quiet. The tycoon turned away, as if distance might dull the barbs in her words. His gaze fell on his grandson again, and stopped. The boy was no longer shaking. He was holding on to Sophia with the fierce, instinctive grip of someone who had found a temporary shore in the middle of rough water. His face, though still wet, had softened. His cheeks rested against her shoulder. He calmed with her, Elena said softly, following his gaze. There was no accusation in it now, only a weary wonder. Not with you, not with me, with her. Henry Harrow, the man whose name could move markets, whose decisions were printed in papers, looked almost lost for a moment. His power didn't disappear. It simply had nowhere useful to go in the face of this small, inexplicable fact. He looked at Sophia again. Really looked, as if seeing her for the first time, and not as part of the decor. "What did you say to him?" he asked. Sophia's throat tightened. "Nothing special," she said. "I told him I was here. I told him it was okay to be sad. I told him," she hesitated, then finished quietly, "that he misses his mom." Elena closed her eyes briefly, the words striking her like a physical touch. When she opened them, they glistened more openly now. "He hasn't heard anyone say that to him in months," she murmured. "Not like that. Not like a fact instead of a problem." The boy shifted, rubbing his face against Sophia's neck. "Mama," he whispered again, barely audible. But this time the word didn't feel like a tear. It felt like a stitch, clumsy and small, trying to pull two torn edges of something back together. A silence followed, different from the others, less sharp, more dense. It was the silence of people realizing they were standing at the edge of a moment that would be remembered long after the bill was paid. Sophia remembered hospital hallways, the way time warped around bad news. She remembered the ache of being the kid in the corner, listening to adults talk about her future like she was furniture. Tonight, she was the one holding the child, and the adults were looking at her as if she'd broken some code by treating his pain like it mattered more than protocol. Elena finally spoke again, her voice low. "He needs someone who isn't afraid of that word," she said. "He needs to say mom without watching you die a little every time. He feels that, Henry. Kids always do." The tycoon took the blow without moving. His knuckles were white on the cane now. He stared at some fixed point on the tablecloth, at the untouched wine, at the crumbs of bread on porcelain. Anything but their faces. "I built an empire," he said after a long pause, as if confessing a crime rather than listing an achievement. "I know how to manage risk, mitigate damage, buy time. I do not know how to, sit with this. Maybe that's the problem," Elena replied, softer now. "You don't sit with it. You outsource it. To schools, to doctors, to silence, and now, apparently to waitresses who happen to care enough to get on their knees in the middle of your dinner." The word waitress didn't sting, not from her. From anyone else, it might have been a dismissal. From Elena, it sounded like a recognition of rank in a war they hadn't agreed to fight. The manager cleared his throat at the edge of the scene, clearly unable to bear the loss of control any longer. "Mr. Harrow," he began nervously, "perhaps we could move you to the private dining room. For comfort, privacy. We can ask the young lady to—" "No," the tycoon cut in, his voice suddenly sharp again. He looked at Sophia, the decision forming in real time behind his eyes. "She's coming with us." Sophia blinked. "Sir, You're off the floor," he said, already pulling a sleek wallet from his pocket with a precision that suggested he'd bought far more complicated things than a few hours of someone's time. "They can survive one service without you. How much do you make in a night?" The question landed like a misstep in a dance, and abrupt, almost crude. Sophia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's not—" "Henry," Elena interrupted, a warning in her tone. "Don't turn this into a transaction." He stopped, caught. The wallet lingered halfway open like a reflex he was slowly dismantling. After a moment, he slid it back into his jacket, looking suddenly, painfully human. "Please," he said instead. The word came out awkward, heavy. It sounded like something he hadn't had to say in a very long time. "He trusts you. I don't know why. I don't care why. I can't watch him fall apart again in front of all these people." His eyes flicked briefly around the room. "And I don't know how to hold him together on my own." The boy's fingers tightened around her collar. He didn't say anything, but his body leaned toward the direction his grandfather was facing, as if caught between two gravities. Sophia looked from the child to the old man, to the woman who carried the shadow of the mother in her face. She thought of her own double shift tomorrow, of rent due next week, of the bruised ache in her knees from kneeling on marble. She thought of the younger version of herself who would have given anything for one adult to stay when things got messy instead of retreating behind excuses. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come." For him, Elena's shoulders lowered a fraction. A breath she'd been holding finally released. The Tycoon didn't smile, but something in his posture loosened, like a knot finally admitting it might have to be undone. The manager opened his mouth to protest, then visibly recalculated when he caught the glint in the Tycoon's eye. "Of course," he said tightly. "We'll clear the private room right away." As he hurried off, the buzz of the restaurant began to return, but differently now. Voices softer, laughter tempered, eyes a little more aware of the quiet battles happening at other tables. Sophia adjusted her hold on the boy, feeling the warm weight of him against her chest. The path to the private room stretched ahead, past the bar, around the curve of the wall, through a door usually reserved for business contracts and birthdays, not for grief. She took a step, then another. The Tycoon walked just ahead of her, Elena at her side like a reluctant ally, the three of them forming a strange, fragile procession through crystal and linen. As they neared the corridor that led away from the main dining room, the boy shifted once more, lifting his head. His eyes, still rimmed red, met hers. "Will you stay?" he whispered, the question barely audible over the murmur they were leaving behind. The door to the private room stood open at the end of the hallway, warm light spilling out, shadows moving inside. Sophia swallowed, realizing this night was about to drag her far deeper into this family's wounds than she had ever planned to go. "I'll stay," she whispered back. And as she crossed the threshold, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just stepping into another room. She was stepping into a story that had begun long before she arrived, and that would demand more from her than a tray and a smile. The private dining room felt like a different country from the main floor. The door closed behind them with a soft thud that cut off the murmur of other people's lives. In here, the lighting was lower, warmer, pooling in soft circles across the linen-draped table and the dark wood-paneled walls. A single arrangement of white lilies sat in the center like something from a memorial service that had lost its address. Sophia shifted the boy in her arms. His weight settled against her as if he'd accepted for tonight. That gravity meant her. His curls were still damp against her neck. She could feel the ghost of each sob in the way he breathed, no longer ragged but not yet calm. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish, wine, and the distant echo of fish and butter from the kitchen. Henry Harrow stopped near the head of the table but didn't sit. The chair stood open behind him like a throne he no longer felt entitled to take. Elena closed the door, then leaned back against it for a moment, as if she needed the solid surface to hold up everything she'd been keeping inside. "Put him on the sofa," she said quietly, nodding toward a small velvet love seat near the window. "He hates chairs right now. Says they feel like waiting rooms." Sophia carried him over, moving slowly so he could decide whether to let go. When she tried to lower him, his arms tightened around her neck in panic. She paused. "We can sit together," she murmured. "Is that okay?" He didn't answer, but he didn't cling harder either. That was consent enough. She sat, letting him half slide into the space between her and the armrest. He stayed plastered to her side, one hand hooked into the fabric of her apron like it was a railing on a too-high balcony. Outside the window, the city glittered. Reflections of car lights traced thin streaks along rain-dark glass. The world went on, indifferent to the small storm gathered in this quiet room. Henry watched them, his cane held uselessly at his side. In every boardroom he'd walked into, he'd known exactly where to stand, what to say, what kind of silence to weaponize. Here, with his grandson pressed against a waitress who smelled faintly of dish soap and citrus, he looked like a man who'd walked into a language he'd never learned. "I thought this room was for celebrations," he said finally, voice low. "Deals, anniversaries, retirements." "It still is," Elena replied, pushing off the door. "Just not the kind you're used to." She moved closer, taking a chair opposite the sofa. Her knees almost brushed the boy's shoes. Her face softened when she looked at him, the sharpness reserved for his grandfather dropping away. "Hey, mijo," she said gently. "You okay?" He kept his face turned into Sophia's shoulder, but one eye peeked out, tracking the sound of her voice. His fingers flexed nervously. "Can we take off your coat?" Sophia asked him softly. "It looks heavy." He hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. She unbuttoned the silver buttons one by one, careful not to rush. Each click felt like unlocking another layer of tension. When she slid the coat off, he shivered once, as if a shield had been removed. Underneath, his sweater was slightly too big, the cuffs swallowing his wrists. The navy wool made his skin look more fragile somehow. Sophia tucked the coat beside him like a folded promise and smoothed a wrinkle from his sleeve. Henry's gaze followed the motion. "You have children?" he asked abruptly. Sophia looked up, surprised. "No." "Then how do you know how to do that?" She thought of the neighbor's cramped apartment, of holding other people's babies while their mothers worked late shifts, of the way you learned to move gently when life hadn't been gentle with you, of the little girl she once was, staring at a door that never opened again. "I grew up around a lot of scared kids," she said. "Sometimes I was one of them." The answer seemed to settle over the room like dust. Soft, inevitable, hard to wipe away. Elena laced her fingers together on her lap, knuckles pale. "You said something out there," she murmured to Sophia, "that sometimes the mouth stops, but the body remembers. Where did you get that?" "It's just true," Sophia replied. "No one had to explain it to me. I felt it." She swallowed. "My mother left when I was 8. For a while I stopped saying mommy at all, but my hands," she glanced down at the boy's fingers still gripping her. "They kept trying to hold on to something that wasn't there." The boy's shoulders drew up around his ears, a small, involuntary reaction. She hadn't meant to say that much, but the air in this room seemed allergic to polished half-truths. Henry looked at her as if seeing a blueprint he'd been missing. "And you survived it," he said. It wasn't a question, but it trembled like one. "I'm here," she answered simply. "Some days that's what surviving means." Elena's gaze slid toward her father-in-law. "He thinks if we don't say her name, we'll all stop bleeding," she said. "He doesn't understand that silence is its own kind of wound." Henry's eyes flashed. "You think I enjoy this?" he demanded quietly, watching him collapse over and over. "You think I don't go home and hear him every time I close my eyes? Then why won't you talk about her?" Elena shot back. "Because every time I do," he said, voice fracturing on the edges. "I see that car, and the rain, and the way they called me instead of him because he was in surgery." He broke off, jaw locking. The boy stiffened at the word car. His breath hitched. Sophia rubbed slow circles on his back, grounding him. "She wasn't perfect," Henry continued after a moment, more quietly. "She made reckless choices. She blew through money like it was air. She almost took him away from any stability at all. I spent years cleaning up her messes." His throat worked around something heavy, but when that truck hit her, none of that mattered. Only the fact that I hadn't answered her last call did. The room seemed to tilt for a second, like an elevator starting to move. Sophia felt a small hand fist more tightly in her apron. "She called you?" Elena asked, her voice sharper now, shock cutting through the fatigue. "When?" He stared at the lilies, unable to meet her eyes. 8 minutes before the accident report," he said. "I was in a meeting. Big deal. Distracted. I saw her name and thought, I'll call back after we sign. And you didn't." He shook his head once. By the time I tried, a stranger answered. Then a paramedic. Elena looked like someone had slapped her. "You never told me that," she said. "What good would it have done?" he asked, bitter. "Add my guilt to yours?" To his. He nodded toward the boy. We had enough. Silence draped over them. It wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they'd never said. The boy shifted, turning his face away from Sophia's neck at last. His eyes, swollen and red, landed on his grandfather. There was no accusation there. Not yet. Just confusion, and a tired kind of hurt. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew she called." Henry's hand tightened on his cane. The leather creaked again. "I found out later," he said. "And I would have done anything to change it. Anything." But life doesn't trade like that. The boy's lower lip trembled. He looked away toward the window, toward the city he was too young to navigate alone. Sophia's heart clenched. She knew the precise moment when a child realized the adults in their life were not gods, not saviors, just flawed people who sometimes made mistakes you never got to fix. It was like watching a glass statue crack from the inside. She leaned closer to him. "Hey," she said softly, "you're allowed to be mad, or sad, or both. None of this is your fault." His gaze flicked back to her, clinging to that last sentence like life raft rope. "Then whose fault is it?" he asked. The question trembled in the air, aimed at no one and everyone. Elena flinched. Henry's shoulders sagged. "There doesn't have to be one person to blame," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the lump in her own throat. "Sometimes bad things happen because someone was careless. Sometimes because someone else didn't look. Sometimes because the world is unfair and no one double-checked the brakes on a truck they should have." She shook her head gently. "None of those reasons mean your love was wrong. Or that hers was." Henry's eyes glistened. He sank slowly into the chair at the head of the table, as if his legs had decided he didn't deserve to stand taller than anyone else in the room. Elena watched Sophia as if she were seeing an equation balance for the first time. "What would have helped you?" she asked quietly. "When you were his age." Sophia thought of the night she'd stopped waiting for footsteps in the hallway. The night she'd understood that abandonment was not something you could charm your way out of. Someone willing to say out loud what everyone else was trying to hide. She replied, "Someone who didn't turn away when I cried because it made them uncomfortable. Someone who didn't treat my sadness like a misbehavior to punish or a problem to fix quickly." Her hand continued its slow path along the boy's back. His breathing had evened out a little, though his eyes stayed locked on his grandfather now. "Can you talk about her?" he whispered, voice so small it barely reached the adults. "About Mama?" The question stabbed through the room with more force than any accusation could have. Henry swallowed. His fingers loosened on the cane as if he were afraid of snapping it in half. "What do you want to know?" he asked, the words dry, rusty from disuse. "Anything," the boy said. "You never do." Elena drew in a soft breath, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry looked at his grandson for a long moment, as if searching his face for permission he'd never asked for before. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Some of the authority was gone, replaced by something older and more vulnerable. "She was loud," he began. "In every way. She laughed with her whole body, like it surprised her every time. She hated winter. Said the city felt like a refrigerator someone forgot to close." A faint involuntary smile touched his mouth and vanished. "She used to sneak you extra dessert when you were small. Thought I didn't know, I did." The boy blinked, absorbing each detail like a parched plant taking in water. "She was late to everything," Henry continued, "except you. The night you were born, she was at the hospital 3 hours early because she was convinced you'd come faster just to spite her." His gaze turned inward, watching a memory only he could see. "She smelled like oranges and cigarette smoke. I hated the second part. She promised she'd quit. She never quite did." Elena's shoulders softened. She seemed to relax and tense at the same time, as if the truth hurt, but also fit finally in a place that had been aching. The boy's voice shook. "Why don't you say those things at home?" "Because every time I start," Henry said, "I see the way you look at the door. Like you think if we talk about her long enough, she might walk through it." Sophia's chest tightened. She understood that too well. Hope could be stubborn in children, long after facts tried to evict it. "And I can't stand," Henry went on quietly, "being the one who has to watch you understand she won't." The boy stared at him, eyes filling again, but the tears were different now, softer, sadder, less frantic. "So you just pretend?" he asked. "Yes," Henry said. "And I see now that it hurt you more than it helped." I'm sorry." The apology didn't thud. It trembled. It was clumsy, unpolished, decades out of practice, but it was real. Sophia felt the room alter around it, the air rearranging like furniture. Elena looked at Henry with something like shock and something like relief. "That's the first time you've said that," she whispered, "to anyone, about anything." He didn't deny it. The boy shifted closer to Sophia again, as if needing to borrow some of her steadiness to process all of this. His fingers flattened against her arm, feeling the slow certainty of her pulse. "Will you?" He hesitated, glancing between his grandfather, his aunt, and Sophia. "Will you still talk about her when we leave here?" Henry opened his mouth, hesitated. This was not a deal he could write into a contract. It was a promise that would demand more than money. "I'll try," he said. "If you want me to." The boy's gaze slid back to the window, to the city lights smeared across the glass. Somewhere out there, cars moved through the night on wet roads. Somewhere out there, a woman had never made it home. He drew a breath that trembled less than the last one. "I do," he said. Silence settled again, but it felt different now. Less like suffocation, more like a deep inhale before the next hard step. Sophia watched them, feeling oddly like someone standing in a doorway between two rooms. The family they'd been, the one they might become. She was an outsider here, a temporary anchor. She knew that, and yet the boy's hand hadn't left her arm. "How long are you staying in New York?" Elena asked softly, as if the idea of Sophia disappearing felt suddenly dangerous. "I live here," Sophia said. "In Queens." Elena nodded slowly, a thought forming. Henry looked at her warily, already sensing where she was going. "Don't," he said. "We need help," she replied. "Not another tutor, not another specialist. Someone who knows this kind of hurt from the inside and isn't afraid of it." She looked at Sophia. Someone like her. Sophia's stomach fluttered. She hadn't expected this turn. Tonight was supposed to be another shift. Another set of empty plates and full glasses. Not whatever this was starting to feel like. Henry stared at the woman on the sofa holding his grandson, at the boy's fingers anchored in her sleeve. The idea in Elena's eyes was clear now, and terrifying. He opened his mouth, not sure yet if he was about to refuse or agree, and before he could decide, the boy lifted his head, looked straight at Sophia, and asked the one question none of them were ready for. "Is she ever coming back?" He whispered. The room held its breath. 3 adults. 1 child. 1 truth waiting to be chosen. And Sophia felt with painful clarity that whatever they said next would change not just tonight, but every night after. "Is she ever coming back?" The question didn't ring out. It fell. Soft, flat, used. Like he'd asked it 100 times already in the dark and never gotten an answer that stuck. Sophia felt the room tilt toward him. The lilies on the table, the shadows on the paneling, even the low lamp seemed to lean in. Henry's hand froze halfway through twisting his napkin. Elena's fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles went white, but he wasn't watching them. He was watching her. From this close she could see how swollen his eyes were, how the skin under them had gone a fragile shade too old for him. His small fingers still clung to the fabric of her apron, the way a child on a bus might hold the strap above their head when the driver braked too hard. She thought of every time someone had dodged that same question for her. She needed time. She might. We don't know. Lies that weren't technically lies and hurt anyway. "Can I tell you the truth?" Sophia asked. His throat bobbed. "Yes." She drew in a breath that felt like glass and let it out slowly. "She's not coming back," she said. "Not the way you mean. Not ever." The air didn't explode. It sank. He didn't scream. His shoulders jerked once, then went very still. Only his grip changed, tightening so hard the seams of her apron dug into her skin. "Ever?" he whispered. She shook her head. "Ever." Something behind his eyes shut like a door, not slammed, just closed. Carefully, her chest ached watching it. "You all lied," he said. Quiet, not theatrical. Just exhausted. Elena flinched as if struck. "We thought if we didn't say it, it would hurt less," she said, voice raw. "We thought we were keeping you from falling apart." "It didn't," he answered. Tears slipped down now, slow and clean. "I still fell apart, just alone." Henry's jaw worked. "I didn't lie," he said. "I just didn't say it," the boy finished, turning his head. "That's the same." The old man's shoulders sagged a fraction. His fingers loosened on the cane, then tightened again, as if he couldn't decide whether to hold on or drop it. Sophia felt something rise in her throat, heavy and hot. "You're allowed to feel that," she told the boy. "To be mad, to feel tricked, None of that makes you bad. He blinked at her, eyes shining. Are you mad? He asked suddenly. About what? She asked gently. Your mom, he said, for leaving you. Henry and Elena both looked at her now, the conversation turning on her like a dial. She glanced down at their hands, his small and damp, hers steadying both of them. I was, she said. For a long time. Are you still? He pressed. She thought of the cracked photo on her sill, of empty chairs at school plays, of learning to fill out forms with NAA where a mother's signature was supposed to go. Sometimes, she said, but not only that. What else? I miss her, Sophia said. And I miss what I never had. Those can live next to each other. Love and anger. They don't cancel each other out. He studied her face like he was checking for any sign she was making it up. So I can be mad at Mama and still love her? Yes, she said. Both can be true. His lip trembled. He turned to Henry again, eyes swimming. Are you mad at her? Henry closed his eyes for a moment like he was bracing for impact. When he opened them, the steel had thinned. Yes, he said quietly. At her, at myself, at the driver, at the rain, at the surgeon who didn't save her, at the phone I didn't pick up. There's enough anger to go around. At me? The boy asked, so soft Sophia barely heard it. Henry pushed himself up and moved closer, lowering himself onto one knee in front of the love seat. The motion looked unfamiliar, like it had been decades since he'd been down at anyone's eye level voluntarily. Not at you, he said. At the fact that you hurt and I didn't know how to help. At the fact that every time I look at you, I see her. That isn't fair to you. But it's true. And he swallowed hard, the next word rough and unused. Sorry. Elena's head snapped toward him. You've never said that, she whispered. Not once. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed on his grandson. The boy's small hand wavered in the space between them. After a long second, it reached out, fingers landing hesitantly on the back of Henry's larger hand. Not forgiveness. Contact. I'm mad too, the boy admitted, voice shaking now. At the truck, at the rain, at the people at the hospital, at you, at Mama, at everybody. You're allowed, Henry said. None of that makes your love smaller. And none of it is your fault. The boy gave a small, broken laugh that wasn't really a laugh. I don't want to forget her, he said. But it hurts when I remember. It will, Sophia said softly, for a while. Probably longer than feels fair. But it won't always feel like you're drowning. How do you know? He asked. Because I'm still here, she answered. And I thought that feeling would swallow me whole. Elena shifted her chair closer and placed her hand lightly on his back. The three adults formed an uneven circle around him without really planning it. I miss her every day, Elena said. Not just as your mom, as my sister, as the only person who knew exactly how bad my bangs looked in 10th grade and loved me anyway. A tiny huff of air escaped him that might have been the beginning of a smile. Henry's mouth twitched. She drove me insane, he said. Your mother. She was impulsive, reckless, loud, but she made a room feel alive. I've been pretending she didn't for so long I almost forgot. Why? The boy asked. Because remembering made me feel like that night was happening all over again, Henry said. And because every time you said Mama, you looked at the door. I couldn't stand watching you wait for someone who wasn't coming, so you pretended she never was, Sophia said quietly. And he learned to pretend with you. The truth hung there, stark and graceless. No one argued with it. The boy sniffed, wiping his nose on the back of his hand. I don't want to remember her alone, he said again, smaller this time. It's too big. You won't, Elena said. Not anymore. We'll talk about her. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Henry nodded slowly. I can't promise I'll be good at it, he said. But I can promise I won't shut the door in her face just because I'm afraid of mine. The boy's eyelids drooped, heavy with a different kind of tiredness now. He leaned more fully into Sophia, his head fitting into the hollow between her shoulder and neck. After a moment, he tilted his face up toward her again. Will you talk too? He asked. About your mom, so I'm not the only one. Sophia let out a soft, disbelieving breath. Yeah, she said, if you want. We can trade stories. I want," he murmured. His eyes slipped shut, lashes fanning against his cheeks. His hand stayed wrapped in the fabric of her apron, but the grip loosened. His breathing shifted, moving toward the slow, uneven rhythm of a child wobbling at the edge of sleep. Henry watched him for a long moment. "We should get him home," he said quietly. "He'll sleep in the car." He hesitated, then added, "If he'll let me carry him." Sophia looked down. "What do you think, pequeño?" she whispered. "Okay if your grandpa holds you?" The boy made a small, tired sound and released her apron. His arms lifted toward Henry, automatic and trust-heavy. Henry moved quickly, as if afraid the window might close. He slid his arms under the boy and lifted. The child's limbs wrapped around him instinctively, head flopping against his shoulder. For a second, the Tycoon looked unsteady, as if the emotional weight was harder to bear than the physical. "Got you," he said, voice rough. Elena rose, wiping under her eyes with one careful swipe. On the table, the lily's scent suddenly felt too strong. She circled to Sophia and stopped a step away. "You know you didn't have to do any of this," she said quietly. "You could have set down that tray and kept walking." "I tried," Sophia said. For about 3 seconds, something like a real smile tugged at the corner of Elena's mouth. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small card and pen, and scribbled quickly. She pressed the card into Sophia's hand, folding her fingers around it. "Call us," she said, "if you're willing to see him again. Not as staff, as you." Henry turned, the boy's breathing warm against his neck. "You don't have to answer now," he added. "But if you say yes, I'll make sure you're not doing this at your own expense, at least not financially." Sophia looked down at the card. The ink was still wet in one corner. A name. A number. A street on the Upper East Side she'd only ever walked through on her way to somewhere else. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think too long," Elena replied gently. Kids don't pause their grief while adults decide. They left the private room together, stepping back into the muted clink and hum of the restaurant. Conversations dipped as they passed, then restarted in lower registers. Waiters looked up and quickly away. The string quartet back at their post slid into something slower without really knowing why. At the door, the host pulled Henry's coat around his shoulders, careful not to jostle the sleeping boy. Snow smudged the glass beyond, turning the streetlights into halos. Henry paused with his hand on the handle. He looked back at Sophia, his expression softer than she'd seen it all night. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll call. If you don't beat us to it." A flicker of warmth moved through her. "I'll answer," she said. They stepped out into the cold, swallowed by the swirl of snow and headlights. The door eased shut behind them with a gentle, final click. For a moment, Sophia just stood there, the quiet of the entryway pressing in. Her arm still carried the ghost weight of the boy. Her ears still held the echo of his question. Her hand tightened around the card, edges biting into her palm. Somewhere above the chandeliers, the city kept moving. Taxis hissing through slush, windows lighting up, lives being lived by people who had no idea that inside this restaurant, a child had finally heard the truth about his mother. Sophia exhaled, feeling the shape of the night settle inside her like a stone and like a seed, both at once. Tomorrow, there would be a phone call. Whether she made it or answered it, she already knew she wouldn't let it go unanswered. Morning light crept through Sophia's curtains in thin, hesitant strokes, as if unsure whether her room was ready to receive it. She sat at the edge of her bed, fingers resting on her knees, letting the quiet settle around her like dust. No rush, no orders shouted across a kitchen, no weight of silver trays pressing into her palms, just the soft hum of her apartment, and the echo of a boy's voice from yesterday. "Will you come back?" She exhaled slowly. Yes, she would. Not because she owed anyone anything, but because something had shifted, subtle and irreversible inside her chest. Her phone buzzed once, a message, from an unknown number and yet not unknown at all. "He's asking if you're awake." Sophia smiled, a small thing that didn't quite reach her eyes but tried. She typed back, "I'm awake. Tell him I'll come by late morning." A moment later, he already put on shoes. "It's 7:14 a.m. Help." Sophia laughed softly into the empty room. She stood, showered, let the warm water run down her shoulders like something washing away more than sleep. She dressed simply. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, the coat she trusted in cold wind. No makeup, except what made her feel unevenly brave. She looked at herself in the mirror, tilted her chin, and nodded. Not a waitress today, just herself. By the time she reached the Harrow residence, the sun had climbed into a pale winter sky, hanging there like a coin someone had forgotten to polish. The doorman recognized her this time and greeted her not with formality, but with a gentle, understanding smile. "He's been waiting, miss," he said. Of course he had. Upstairs, she found the penthouse door already cracked open, warm air slipping into the hallway like an invitation. Elena stood inside, one hand wrapped around a mug and the other rubbing her temple. "He's been pacing," she said. "You'd think Beyoncé was coming." Sophia grinned. "Sorry, I'm not Beyoncé." "Trust me," Elena murmured. "He doesn't need Beyoncé. He needed you." The boy appeared behind her a second later, nearly skidding on the hardwood. His hair stuck up on one side, his sweater half-tucked, socks mismatched. "You came," he breathed, as if she'd crossed oceans instead of a few train lines. "I said I would," Sophia replied. He reached for her hand without hesitation. She didn't hesitate either. In the living room, Henry stood by the window, hands clasped loosely behind his back. He wasn't dressed like a tycoon. He wore an old sweater, comfortable slacks, slippers. And for the first time, he didn't look like he was carrying the weight of a legacy. He looked like a grandfather trying his best not to get in the way. "Good morning," he said, voice softer than usual. "Morning," Sophia answered. He didn't thank her again. He didn't need to. Gratitude lived in the way he stepped aside to let the boy pull her toward the sofa. They spent the first hour in the smallest things. Legos, pencils, a deck of cards missing 2 queens. The boy stayed close to her, knees touching, shoulder brushing. No tears today. But his eyes flicked to her face every few minutes, as if checking she was still real. Elena made tea. Henry pretended to read the newspaper but didn't turn a single page. At one point, the boy paused mid-story, looked down at his hands and said quietly, "Last night was the first night I didn't dream about the accident." Sophia's breath caught. Elena froze where she stood. Henry lowered the paper entirely. The boy kept talking, not knowing his words had cracked the air open. "I dreamed of Mama," he said, "but not the scary part. She was at a beach. We were building a castle. I woke up sad, but not the hurting kind. The other kind." Sophia touched the edge of his sleeve. "That's how it starts." "How what starts?" "Healing." He nodded slowly, absorbing the word like a stone warming under sunlight. A little later, he left the room to get something from his bedroom. Elena sank onto the couch beside Sophia. "You're good for him," she said. "In a way none of us expected." "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Sophia said softly. "No one thinks you are," Elena replied. "But you're making him brave enough to remember. That's rare." Henry approached from the window, leaning lightly on his cane. His eyes weren't cold today. They held depth instead. Quiet, uneasy depth, like someone standing at the edge of a confession. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Sophia replied. "I owe you honesty," he corrected. She didn't speak. She let him. He looked at his grandson's closed bedroom door, then at the floor. "I didn't just avoid talking about my daughter," he said. "I erased things, photos, keepsakes, memories. All the things grief made me afraid to touch." Sophia swallowed. "Fear does that." He nodded. "I thought forgetting her would make losing her hurt less. But all it did was teach him to hide his pain. And myself too, if I'm being truthful." Elena's eyes glistened, but she kept quiet. "I can't ask you to fix this family," Henry said. "That isn't your job. But you changed the direction of it." Sophia let the words settle before answering. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said, "just to show him he doesn't have to carry grief alone." Henry exhaled long and heavy. "Would you consider continuing to see him? Not as pity, not as charity, but as someone who understands him." Sophia looked at the hallway, at the soft shadows, at the photo on the shelf, the woman laughing, alive, luminous. Then back at Henry. "I can be here," she said, As long as it's good for him. Henry's shoulders eased, just slightly. Relief softened the corners of his mouth when the boy returned carrying a picture he'd drawn. A beach, a woman with wind in her hair and 3 figures holding hands. He climbed onto the couch between Sophia and his grandfather. "I drew us," he said proudly. "Not a family, just us." Sophia traced the page with her eyes. The drawing wasn't polished, but it was honest in a way most adults never learn to be. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's real," he replied. The afternoon unfolded gently. Hot cocoa, stories, soft laughter that felt like a miracle after the week they'd had. Sophia stayed until the sky dimmed into violet blue, until the boy began to blink sleepily against her arm. When she finally stood to leave, he followed her to the door. "Can you do the goodnight thing?" he whispered. She knelt so their faces were level. "Of course." He closed his eyes, leaned forward, and rested his forehead against hers. "Good night, Mama," he murmured into the quiet. Sophia whispered her own good night a second later, voice trembling with a secret no one else in the room could feel. Henry walked her to the elevator again. But today something had changed. He didn't walk behind her. He walked beside her. At the elevator doors he hesitated. "You didn't just help him," he said. "You helped all of us." Sophia shook her head gently. "No, I just told the truth." "Sometimes," Henry said. "That's the bravest thing anyone can do." The elevator chimed. She stepped inside. He didn't say goodbye. She didn't either. Some connections didn't need the word. On the train ride home, city lights flickered past the windows in long, trembling streaks. Sophia pressed her forehead to the cold glass and let the warmth gather behind her ribs. At home, she turned on one lamp. The room glowed softly. Her mother's old photo sat on the table. Faded, fragile, full of life. Sophia touched its corner. "Good night, Mommy," she whispered, not in sadness, in recognition. And somewhere across the city, a little boy whispered his own good night into the dark, no longer in fear, but in memory. 2 voices, 2 homes, 1 truth finally spoken aloud. And because of that truth, both of them were just a little less alone than yesterday.